When I turned 62, I thought I'd finally rest. After decades of teaching, raising a family, and burying my husband, all I wanted was a quiet corner in the world where I was still needed. So when my son and daughter-in-law asked me to move in, saying, "Mom, this house isn't complete without you," I cried, happy tears. But 3 months later, on my birthday, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cold donut while their Instagram showed a $200 steak dinner. For her mother. I didn't say a word. I just smiled and started packing. My name is Linda. I'm 62 years old, and until last fall, I lived alone in the little brick house my late husband and I bought in 1987. It was quiet, creaky in the winter, but filled with memories, some loud, some tender. After he passed away 3 years ago, the silence took a different shape. Not painful, just still. I spent most days tending my garden, volunteering at the library twice a week, and video calling my grandson whenever Melissa allowed it. I didn't ask for much. I'd gotten used to being needed only in bits. Occasional babysitting, holiday dinners, the expected batch of cookies mailed across town. I told myself that was enough. But then I slipped. It was silly, really. Just a missed step in the backyard, a bruised hip, a twisted ankle. But it scared me more than I admitted. Lying there in the garden soil, ants crawling near my ears, I realized how alone I was. Jason arrived 40 minutes later, Melissa in tow, her hair perfect, her tone tight with concern. They drove me to urgent care, sat in the waiting room like good children. And that night, over lukewarm soup, Jason said, "Mom, why don't you come stay with us for a while? Just until you get back on your feet." I blinked, surprised. Then Melissa added, "We've been thinking about it anyway. It'll be easier to keep an eye on you. The guest room's already half ready." I didn't cry, but something shifted in my chest, a warm weight, an invitation, a place to belong again. 2 weeks later, I moved in with one suitcase, my favorite kettle, and a worn photo album. Their house was bigger than mine ever was. Open-plan kitchen, white marble counters, a backyard trampoline for Noah, my grandson. Melissa greeted me with a cheerful, "Make yourself at home," and pointed me to the guest room, painted gray-blue. I felt like I was entering a new chapter, one where I mattered again. At first, everything was nice. Too nice, perhaps. Melissa labeled things in the kitchen just to help and handed me a printout of Noah's daily routine. Jason helped carry my old recliner into the living room, though it looked out of place among their modern furniture. Noah was thrilled to have me around. Every evening he'd run in after school yelling, "Grandma, did you bake cookies today?" And of course, I always had. I kept the house tidy when they were at work. Cooked dinners that reminded Jason of his childhood. Meatloaf, chicken pot pie, sweet cornbread. I picked Noah up from soccer practice when schedules clashed. Melissa said, "You're a lifesaver," more than once. I clung to that phrase like a lifeline, but I never asked questions, never suggested changes. I noticed Melissa moving my slow cooker to a high cabinet, saying it clashed with her stainless steel. I laughed it off. I started doing laundry only when they weren't home after Melissa mentioned the noise messed with her Zoom calls. I didn't want to intrude. I was grateful. I told myself this was temporary, just until I felt steady again. Still, at night when the house was quiet and I sat on the edge of the bed I now called mine, I would trace the photo frame on the nightstand. A picture of Jason at age 5, covered in mud, grinning like the world was still innocent. I whispered to that version of him more often than I did to the adult he'd become. I didn't talk about the pain in my hip that lingered longer than expected. I didn't complain when Melissa rearranged the pantry and put my snacks on the top shelf. I didn't protest when the family dinners shifted from daily to weekly, or when my stories were met with distracted nods instead of laughter. I didn't say anything, because mothers don't. Not the kind who were raised to believe love means endurance, not expectation. So I stayed silent, helpful, invisible, until the donut. The house Jason and Melissa lived in wasn't new to me. It was in fact mine, or had been. My husband and I bought it when Jason was just a toddler. We raised him within those very walls. Every scratch on the wooden floor, every creak in the hallway, those were the echoes of my past. Years ago, when Jason needed collateral for a business loan, I had agreed to a temporary title transfer. A lawyer drew up the papers. We never switched it back. At the time, I didn't see the need. Family trusts family. When I moved in, none of that mattered to me. I wasn't interested in legalities or ownership. I just wanted to feel needed, useful, part of something. I thought I had been given that. My days quickly fell into routine. Up at 6 to prepare Noah's lunch, wipe down the counters, brew Melissa's favorite chai. She never asked, but I figured it was one less thing for her to worry about. By mid-morning, I'd make a grocery list, walk 2 blocks to the store, then return in time to prep dinner. Simple meals, ones with stories attached. This meatloaf was Jason's favorite after Little League, I'd say. Melissa would smile politely, glance at her phone, and say, "How quaint, Linda." Jason was rarely home before 7. He'd give me a quick kiss on the cheek, thank me for dinner, and go change out of his work clothes. Sometimes we'd talk, briefly, about his day, but usually Noah's iPad won that competition. I didn't mind. The boy was bright and sweet, and his hugs were worth every lonely hour. Still, little things began to itch at the edges of my contentment. One afternoon, I came home with a bag of groceries, and Melissa was reorganizing the kitchen. My slow cooker sat beside a stack of donate items. "Oh," I said gently, "I still use that one." Melissa smiled tight. "It just doesn't really match the rest of the kitchen, you know? I can show you a recipe that works in the Instant Pot." She didn't mean to be cruel. I told myself that often. Just particular. She liked things her way, and I was in her space. At least, that's how she phrased it. "I've updated the grocery list. Try not to double buy," she said one day, tapping the digital note on her phone. "I've got a whole system going. Helps the flow of my kitchen." My kitchen. That phrasing surfaced again and again. This is how we handle Noah's bedtime. "Let's keep the hallway clear. It's just how I like it." "Can you check with me before using my diffuser in the bathroom?" At first I adjusted. I wanted to make it easy for them. I thought, maybe Melissa's just used to control. She works in corporate HR after all. But soon I began to feel like a guest overstaying her welcome. I cooked in silence, wiped fingerprints off stainless steel like they were sins, and tiptoed through shared spaces that didn't feel shared at all. There was no space truly mine. The guest room was just that, a place for me to sleep. No desk, no reading nook. I asked once about putting up a photo of my husband in the living room. Melissa said, "Oh, maybe in your room. I just try to keep the decor minimal out here." One evening, I sat with Jason on the patio after Noah went to bed. I mentioned how much the backyard had changed. No more roses, now just a trampoline and artificial turf. "Melissa loves low maintenance," he said, not looking up from his phone. I smiled. "Do you remember when you fell into the rose bushes chasing the neighbor's cat?" He chuckled faintly. "Barely." I studied his face. Same jawline as his father. Same silence when conflict hovered. I wanted to ask if he remembered this house belonged to me once, but the words felt petty. Ownership wasn't what mattered, right? Still, the silence between us that night stayed with me. Not heavy, just hollow. I began to notice more. Decisions made without me. Trips planned, dinners hosted for Melissa's colleagues where I stayed in my room, a dinner party for Melissa's mom where I was invited but asked to let the caterers handle everything. I folded napkins anyway, cleaned up afterward, sat with Noah when he got sleepy and wandered off from the grown-ups. To them, I was helpful, quiet, available, a utility wrapped in polite smiles. And still, I didn't complain. Because for a mother, that was the job, or so I'd believed. I began noticing patterns, not all at once, but like small drops of water slowly wearing down stone, The guest room I was given was just off the main hallway next to the room I had gently asked, only once, if I could use as a reading space. It had good light, a window facing the backyard, and a quietness to it that reminded me of early mornings with coffee and books. Melissa had smiled and said, "That room's mostly storage for now. We're using it to rotate seasonal decor. Let's keep it that way." I let it go. 2 weeks later, I passed by the room and noticed the door was slightly open. Inside was a suitcase, a pair of beige pumps, and a silk robe I didn't recognize. On the dresser sat a mug that said, "World's Best Mom." A soft hum of a sleep machine buzzed faintly. The next morning, I saw her, Melissa's mother. She emerged from the room with a towel on her head and greeted me with a casual, "Morning, Linda," like she belonged there. Melissa chirped behind her, "Mom's just staying for a couple of nights. She had a little procedure, and it's easier for her to rest here." That room, the one I wasn't allowed to sit in, was now a recovery suite. I made her tea and said nothing. Later that week, I fried catfish for dinner, one of Jason's childhood favorites. As I cleaned up, Melissa leaned in and whispered, "Next time, can we avoid frying? The oil smell really lingers." I nodded, wiping the counter slower than usual. That night, I boiled chicken and steamed broccoli. Another evening, I tossed a load of laundry into the machine after 9 p.m. Melissa appeared in the hallway in yoga pants and a sleep mask perched on her head like a crown. "Hey, sorry," she said sweetly. "The washer's super loud through Noah's room. Can we keep laundry too before dinner, just while he's in school?" I agreed, and began washing my clothes in the early afternoons when no one was around to hear. The rules were always wrapped in silk, never accusations, just soft requests that left me feeling loud, messy, and somehow wrong. One Saturday morning, I woke up early and tiptoed to the kitchen. I wanted to make cinnamon rolls for Noah. The house was still, the kind of stillness you learn to move through like a whisper. As I kneaded dough, I heard a voice. Melissa's. Sharp. Not meant for me. I know, but she's still here. It's been 4 months. How long are we supposed to let this go on? Silence. Then, no, she's not awful. She's just always around, like she's part of the furniture. My chest tightened. I quietly backed into the hallway, heart pounding. The cinnamon dough sagged beneath my fingers like something deflated. She didn't know I'd heard. She smiled at me over coffee 15 minutes later, saying, "Noah couldn't wait for his Nana's rolls." I smiled back. That night, I sat in my room staring at the ceiling, counting the whirs of the ceiling fan like they were years. I thought about my husband, how he used to say, "If you're too quiet, people forget you're in the room." Maybe I'd gotten too good at being quiet. From that day, I kept a notebook. I wrote down the dates, the comments, the moments that left bruises without fingerprints. Not because I planned to use them, just because I needed to know I wasn't imagining it. One afternoon, I watched as Melissa and her mother redecorated the living room. Throw pillows changed, a new rug arrived, my old recliner vanished. Jason didn't notice or pretended not to. Noah asked, "Where's Grandma's chair?" Melissa replied, "It didn't match anymore." I said nothing. But inside, something cracked. I never made a fuss about birthdays, not even my own. But that year, as my 63rd approached, I decided to make a quiet celebration. Nothing grand, just a home-cooked dinner, something nostalgic. I'd make Jason's favorite from when he was 8, creamy mashed potatoes, honey-glazed carrots, and rosemary chicken. I even found the old recipe card, the one with my late husband's messy scribbles on the side. Don't forget extra garlic. Jason likes it that way. The morning of my birthday, I woke before dawn. The house was still dark. I boiled eggs, prepped ingredients, made sure Noah's lunchbox had a sweet note tucked inside. I wanted the day to feel like any other, because deep down, I feared it might be exactly that. By noon, the chicken was marinating. The dining table was set. Nothing fancy, just placemats and folded napkins. I even placed a tiny ceramic angel in the center. a symbol, perhaps, that this house still held some grace. Melissa breezed in around 2 p.m., sunglasses atop her head, fingers flying across her phone. She paused by the kitchen, sniffed the air. "Oh, wow, something smells nostalgic," she said, not quite smiling. I wiped my hands and nodded. I thought it'd be nice to cook Jason's favorite. For today. Her brow furrowed. Today? I watched her face. The blankness lasted just a second too long. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A message from Jason. "Hey Mom, last minute thing. We're taking Melissa's mom out for her birthday. She's been having a rough week. You okay for dinner? We'll be back late. Love you." I read it twice. My fingers hovered above the screen. My heart didn't sink. It just went still. Like a lake the moment before a storm. I typed back, "Of course. Enjoy." Melissa didn't mention anything. She retreated upstairs, heels clicking softly. That evening, I set aside the rosemary chicken. I wrapped the mashed potatoes, stored the carrots in glass containers, and put the angel figurine back in its box. I didn't cry. There wasn't even room for sadness, just a kind of numb understanding. Around 6:45 p.m., I walked to the nearby market. It was already dark, the air crisp. Inside, I found a small donut in the bakery section, maple glazed, my favorite. I asked the cashier for a single candle. He smiled and said, "Celebrating someone?" I lied and said it was for my grandson. Back home, I lit the candle alone in the kitchen. I didn't sing, I didn't make a wish. I stared at the flame until it flickered out. Then I took a bite of the donut. It was cold, the glaze too thick, but it was mine. I washed the plate, put the rest of the donut in the fridge, just in case Noah wanted a taste. Later that night, I opened Instagram out of habit. There they were, Jason, Melissa, her mother, even Noah, all dressed up at a steakhouse downtown. The photo was elegant, wine glasses clinked, plates filled with perfect cuts of ribeye. The caption read, "Nothing beats celebrating the Queen. Happy birthday to the best mom ever." 58 likes in 10 minutes. A string of comments. "Gorgeous fam." "She deserves it." "Love how you honor her." I stared at the screen. My thumb hovered over the heart icon, but I couldn't press it. I didn't feel hate. Not envy, just erased. There was no mention of me. No double celebration. Not even a text that said, "Happy birthday" afterward. I scrolled back to an old photo, a blurry image from 5 years ago. Jason and I in the garden, hands covered in soil, grinning like idiots. I'd posted it on his birthday that year. I read my own caption again. "Happy birthday to my favorite reason for gray hair. Love you more than all the roses we ever planted." And for the first time that evening, my eyes stung. But I didn't cry. Instead, I stood up, walked to my room, and opened the journal I'd started weeks ago. I wrote one line. "Today, I learned what it feels like to disappear." After cleaning the kitchen, I packed away the dinner I had cooked with such quiet hope. Jason's childhood favorite, untouched. The chicken sat neatly in foil, the carrots sealed tight in a container as if preservation might somehow give the moment a second chance. The mashed potatoes went into the fridge last. I didn't write a note. I knew no one would ask. I placed the half-eaten donut in a small glass bowl, covered it with cling wrap, and set it beside the milk. I told myself someone might want it. Maybe Noah. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of laughter coming from Melissa's phone upstairs. Probably a video recap of their dinner. I could almost hear her mother's voice, shrill and delighted, floating through the walls. I turned off the lights in the kitchen, the hallway, the living room. Each click of the switch felt like closing a door behind me. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't reach for the TV remote or the book I had been pretending to read for weeks. Instead, I sat still, hands folded, listening to my own breath. There was no anger. I wasn't raised to expect fanfare. My mother taught me to give quietly and accept even quieter. So I didn't blame Jason or Melissa or even Melissa's mother, who had no idea what day it was for me. But that absence, the total lack of acknowledgement, felt like a small funeral held in secret with no mourners and no flowers. Around 9 p.m., Noah came into my room, rubbing his eyes. "Grandma," he mumbled, "wasn't it your birthday today?" I turned to him slowly, smiling as naturally as I could. "What made you think that, sweetheart?" "I saw your ID when we made that library card. You said November 10th. He blinked. "That's today." He wasn't accusing, just confused. I smoothed his hair. "It's not a big deal, honey. Sometimes grown-ups forget things." He yawned and curled up beside me. "I wouldn't forget your birthday." I held on to that sentence, let it soak into my skin like balm. After he fell asleep, I carried him back to his room, tucking him in gently. His small hand clung to mine for a moment before releasing. Back in my room again, I opened the bottom drawer of the nightstand. Inside was a plain, leather-bound notebook. Brown, unmarked, the pages still crisp. I had bought it decades ago, thinking I'd journal through motherhood. I never wrote a word. Life got busy, then messy, then too heavy for blank pages. But tonight, I opened it. The pen felt awkward in my hand, like greeting an old friend I hadn't spoken to since college. November 10th, dear me, today. I cooked dinner for people who never came. I watched photos of laughter that didn't include me. I smiled at a child who remembered my birthday when no one else did. And I kept quiet because what else is there left to say when no one is listening? The ink bled slightly on the page. Like it, too, had waited too long to speak. I wrote more, not as a list of complaints, but to remind myself of the facts. That I existed, that I had cooked, that I had been forgotten, that Noah had remembered. I didn't cry. Tears require an expectation unmet, but when expectations die, silence takes their place. That silence sat with me all night. Not heavy, just steady. Like a dull ache you stop noticing because it's become part of your rhythm. Before bed, I placed the journal on my nightstand, not tucked away this time. Visible, accessible. Tomorrow, I would write again, not because I needed to vent, but because for the first time in years, I realized I had been writing my life in invisible ink, seen by no one. Now I would write it in pen. A week after my birthday, I found myself in the garage, not out of purpose, just trying to make space. Melissa had mentioned her mother might rotate some of her seasonal decorations, and I took the hint. The boxes labeled Linda Misk had been stacked in a dark corner since I moved in. I hadn't opened them since leaving my old house. Dust clung to the lids like accusation. I pulled out the top one and opened it. Inside were layers of the life I used to live. Sheet music from when I taught choir, a faded recipe book with tabs sticking out like tired flags, greeting cards from decades past. Most were from Jason, childish handwriting evolving into rushed adult scrawl over the years. Underneath, wrapped in a manila folder, was something heavier, legal papers. I sat down on an overturned crate, the air thick with old paint and motor oil. The folder held photocopies of documents I'd long forgotten, insurance forms, retirement fund summaries, and, at the very bottom, a property deed. I held it closer, squinting at the faint ink. Owner of record, Linda May Roth, my full name. The address listed was the very one I now lived in, the house Jason and Melissa called theirs. I blinked, read it again. The page wasn't dated recently. It was from 15 years ago, back when Jason had just launched his first business and needed help with a loan. I remembered sitting at a lawyer's office, Jason beside me, nervous and grateful. "It's just temporary, Mom," he'd said. "The bank needs to see assets. You're not really giving it away. It'll come back to you." I had signed without reading the fine print. Trust was a mother's language. But now, the copy I held, why did it still have my name? I flipped through the folder. A yellow Post-it note stuck to one of the pages, faded but still legible. Keep for tax records. Jason. No sign of any document showing a transfer back. No updates. No signatures from me handing over the house in full. My fingers trembled. I took the folder to my room, placed it on the bed, and stared at it like it might speak. Then I opened my journal and added a line. December 2nd. Found deed. House still in my name? Confirm. Don't jump to conclusions. That night, at dinner, I looked at Jason across the table. He talked about work, layoffs, new investors, long hours. Melissa chimed in with complaints about a supplier for her event planning company. The conversation buzzed around me like I wasn't there. I wanted to ask, who owns this house? But the words stuck. Instead, I cleared the plates, rinsed them, and returned to my room. There, I dug deeper. Emails, texts, anything. In an old email account I barely used anymore, I searched house deed and Jason. Several threads popped up from 2008. One caught my eye. Loan documents, RE temp title. I opened it. It was a message from Jason to his loan officer. The house is under my mom's name for now. She's agreed to sign over if needed. If needed? My breath caught. I remembered signing something at his request. Some temporary clause, he said. But I didn't recall ever reversing it. No lawyer had contacted me. No papers had returned for finalization. Had they just assumed, or had they hoped I'd never check? A whisper of doubt turned louder. The next day, while Melissa and Jason were out, I checked the kitchen drawer labeled important stuff. Melissa's handwriting, neat, assertive. Inside were utility bills, Noah's school forms, and, wedged at the back, a stapled pack of documents from a real estate agency. Property appraisal request. I scanned it. The address was ours. The name listed as owner, Jason Roth, but the handwriting at the bottom, circled in red ink, said pending legal verification of title. I folded it back, careful to place everything as I found it. Later that evening, I wrote again. December 3rd. Documents show Jason claims title, but legal records still list me. Something doesn't add up. I didn't feel rage. Not yet. But the weight of uncertainty pressed on me like a heavy quilt in a hot room. I couldn't sleep. My mind turned corners I had once closed off. Had this all been orchestrated? The invitation to move in, the subtle control, the removal of my space, my voice. Had it all been part of a longer plan? Or was I just becoming paranoid? Either way, one thing was certain. I needed to know the truth. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe I misunderstood the documents. Maybe something had changed, legally, without my knowledge. Some benign oversight. But I couldn't let the doubt gnaw any deeper without answers. So I called Carol. We hadn't spoken in nearly a year. Carol had been my best friend in college, now a semi-retired estate attorney with a no-nonsense voice and a laugh like gravel. She picked up on the second ring. "Linda Roth," she said. "You better be calling with good gossip." "More like a quiet emergency," I replied. I explained everything. The loan from years ago, the unsigned transfer, the recent appraisal document. I could hear her typing as I talked. "You have the property address?" I gave it to her. "Give me 24 hours, she said. "I'll pull title records from the county database. Sit tight." That night, I couldn't sleep. The hallway creaked like it was whispering doubts through the walls. I scrolled my journal entries, rereading each one, noticing how they'd shifted from sadness to suspicion without me realizing. I was no longer just heartbroken. I was on alert. The next afternoon, Carol called. "It's still yours, Linda," she said. "Clear as day. Title's in your name, no liens, no transfers filed. It was never legally signed over to Jason. Nothing's changed since 2008. I felt the blood rush to my ears. "So everything, this house, it's legally mine?" "Every square foot," she confirmed. I sat down on the edge of my bed, the phone still pressed to my cheek. Why would they not tell me that? Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I can't tell you motives, But I'd start locking up your paperwork. And Linda, get a copy of that appraisal you mentioned. Something's off. I hung up and stared around the room that had felt like a borrowed space since day one. Now it looked different, like a stage set I had unknowingly owned all along. I returned to the drawer in the kitchen. Melissa and Jason were out at Noah's soccer game. I didn't have much time. I scanned through the files again, this time opening every folder. That's when I found it. An email, printed out and stapled, tucked between property tax estimates. It was addressed to a real estate broker from Melissa's personal Gmail. Subject, future listing inquiry. Body, hi Emily, once the property title is fully under Jason's name, we'd love to move forward with staging. Tentative plan is to list by late spring, ideally before summer. We'll need assistance navigating the transfer process discreetly. Looking forward to working with you. Below that, in red pen, a note. Call after Melissa's mom moves in full-time. Timing is key. I sat at the kitchen table and read the email 5 times. They were planning to sell the house. My house. The one I was invited to live in like a guest, only to be erased as quietly as I'd been welcomed. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't come with yelling or slammed doors. It came in bullet points and real estate timelines. I walked back to my room and closed the door. For the first time in months, I didn't feel uncertain. I felt awake. I pulled the journal from my drawer. December 5th. Carol confirmed it. Title still in my name. Melissa and Jason planning to sell. Email found. They're waiting for timing. They think I won't notice. They think I won't fight. I placed the email in a file folder, then added the deed copy, then printed the county title search Carol had sent. I put it all in a manila envelope and labeled it in thick black ink, in case I forget who I am. That night, over dinner, Melissa complained about property taxes going up. We really need to start thinking long-term, she said to Jason. Maintenance alone could kill us. Jason nodded. We'll figure it out. I stirred my soup quietly. Melissa turned to me, smiling. Don't you think, Linda? Sometimes it's best to downsize. I smiled back, steady. Yes, I said, sometimes it is. From that day on, I learned to play a different role. The same smile, the same careful dinner prep, the same thank you when Melissa corrected how I loaded the dishwasher. But underneath the silence, I began building a case, quietly, methodically, not out of vengeance, out of necessity. I started by recording conversations, not all, just the ones where Melissa and Jason spoke in vague but telling terms. You'll handle the paperwork, she whispered one evening in the kitchen. I was folding napkins behind the pantry door. I don't want her asking questions. Jason replied, She won't. She never has. I pressed the voice recorder on my phone, barely breathing. Later, I photographed the appraisal documents and the printed email. I backed them up to a hidden cloud folder, sent copies to a new email account I created just for this, one even Melissa wouldn't know existed. Each evening, when they thought I was reading or asleep, I added to my growing archive. I created a timeline, labeled each file. I had taught high school English for 30 years. I knew how to build a narrative. But even with evidence stacking, I felt isolated, afraid that maybe I was still overreacting. Then came Grace. She lived 2 doors down, a widow like me, mid-60s, with perfectly trimmed rose bushes and a barky terrier named Max. We had exchanged pleasantries for months, but I never knew her story until that chilly Thursday morning when we bumped into each other at the mailbox. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, eyeing the tight grip I had on my coat. I laughed softly, just dealing with family. Her eyes softened. The kind that invites you in and slowly makes you disappear? I stared at her, stunned. She nodded, then glanced around and said, Tea. My place. Now. Over mugs of Earl Grey and lemon cookies that tasted like real butter and comfort, she told me her story. Her son had convinced her to move in after her husband passed, said it would be more efficient for everyone. Within 6 months, her room had turned into a storage space. Her name was quietly removed from the shared account, and they had nearly sold the house she paid for, until she caught the paperwork just in time. "I was lucky," she said. "Found out the week before the sale. Took everything. Left before they even noticed. They called me selfish. I told her mine. Every word. She didn't blink, didn't gasp, just nodded like a woman who had walked through the same storm in different shoes. "You have proof?" she asked. I showed her. She whistled. "They're bold." I don't know what to do next. "You don't have to scream to win," Grace said. "Sometimes the best revenge is the kind you serve with a smile and a notary stamp." We spent the next hour laying out a plan, not of attack, but of withdrawal. Clean, legal, irrefutable. First, Grace connected me to her real estate attorney, someone discreet. Then we created a digital backup of every file on a flash drive she kept at her house. Next, she helped me open a new bank account, separate from anything tied to Jason. I moved what savings I had there. Then we drafted a letter of intent to sell the house. Not to Jason, not to Melissa, but to a nonprofit educational trust I had quietly supported for years. "I don't want the money," I told Grace. "You want the message," she replied. "Exactly, and I deliver it not with confrontation, but with calm." Back at home, I continued my performance. When Melissa asked me to help prep her mom's room for a longer stay, I nodded. When Jason mentioned they were tight on cash, I offered leftovers. When Noah asked if we could bake cookies for his school event, I said yes, as always. But every word, every movement was part of a chess game now, a quiet strategy unfolding under their noses. I wasn't angry. I was prepared. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like myself again, not the ghost of someone's mother, not the silent helper. I was the woman who still owned the roof over their heads. They just didn't know it yet. There's a kind of power in quiet decisions. No slamming doors, no screaming matches, just a slow, deliberate shift that changes everything. The first decision I made was about the house, not to keep it, not to sell it for profit, but to turn it into something no one could claim, manipulate, or exploit again. I contacted Grace's attorney, a soft-spoken man named Martin, who wore suspenders and asked more questions than he answered. That was a good sign. He reviewed my deed, the title documents, and the folder of evidence I'd built. Then we drafted a will, one that replaced the outdated version Jason probably still thought existed. In it, I left the house and its full value to the Midwestern Women's Teaching Fellowship, a scholarship fund for women over 40 returning to education. I had supported it quietly for years. This time, my contribution would change lives. Martin slid the documents across the desk. "Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure," I said, signing with a steady hand. From there, I made my second decision. I would leave, but not abruptly. Not like a woman running away. I would walk out on my terms. That same week, I visited a small retirement community 20 minutes away. Tucked behind a park, it offered independent apartments, a library with weekly readings, and a tiny cafe that served real coffee, not the decaf dust Melissa insisted on. They showed me a one-bedroom unit overlooking a pond. "I'll take it," I said. I paid the deposit in full, quietly, no announcements. No moving trucks. Then came the final part of the plan, the goodbye they'd never see coming. I waited 2 more weeks, long enough for the paperwork to finalize, the unit to be furnished with secondhand charm, and the fridge to be stocked. During that time, I cooked as usual, smiled as always, nodded when Melissa mentioned how seamless things were becoming. "Feels like we finally found a rhythm," she told Jason one night. I smiled and said, "Yes, I think so too." The next day, I sent out invitations, just a small group, Jason, Melissa, Noah, and Melissa's mother. A handwritten card slipped under their doors. "Please join me this Sunday evening for a thank you dinner. My treat, my way. No exceptions." Melissa raised an eyebrow. "What's the occasion?" "You'll see," I said, smiling. I spent the weekend preparing. I made all the classics: meatloaf, rosemary chicken, mashed potatoes with extra garlic. I set the table with linen napkins, polished silverware, and the angel figurine I once packed away after my forgotten birthday. I even baked a cake. Not for me this time, for closure. Sunday evening arrived. They trickled in, all slightly suspicious, but lured by the smell of home-cooked food. Melissa's mother complimented the table. Jason gave me a hug that didn't quite land. Noah sat beside me, cheerful as always. We ate. We talked. I told stories Jason hadn't heard in years, about his first spelling bee, the time he glued his shoes to the porch. For the first time in months, they laughed. After dessert, I stood. "I want to thank you," I said, raising my glass, "for letting me be part of this house again, for giving me a place in your lives. It's meant more than you know." Melissa beamed, slightly tipsy. "Well, you've done so much for us, Linda." Jason nodded. "It's been great having you here." I smiled. "That's why I want to leave something behind, a gift, a transition." I reached into my bag and pulled out 4 envelopes, one for each of them. I handed them out gently. Jason opened his first. His smile faded. Melissa's eyes darted across the document in her hands. Her knuckles whitened. Melissa's mother blinked, confused. Noah looked at me. "What is it, Grandma?" Jason looked up. "You're selling the house?" "No," I said softly. "I've already sold it, in spirit. The paperwork is done. The house will belong to a scholarship fund for women like me who spent decades giving and just need one chance to begin again." Melissa's voice rose. "You didn't even talk to us." "You never asked," I said. "Not once. Not when you moved my chair or gave away my room or planned to sell what wasn't yours." The room went silent. "I'm not angry," I continued. "This isn't revenge. It's a lesson. One I should have taught you earlier." Jason lowered his head. Melissa said nothing. I turned to Noah and knelt beside him. "I'll always be nearby. You can visit any time, and we'll bake cookies in my new kitchen, just the way you like." He hugged me tight. And just like that, I stood, walked out of the dining room, and closed the door behind me. Not loudly, just finally. The invitation was written in blue ink on thick cream stationery Melissa had once bought for holiday cards she never sent. I found it in the office drawer, still wrapped. It felt right to use something of theirs, just this once, for my own purpose. "Please join me this Sunday for a special dinner, a celebration of 1 year together, just family, just us." I slipped the envelopes under their doors at dawn. No texts, no explanations. By mid-morning, Jason asked, "What's the occasion?" 1 year, I replied simply. "Seems worth marking, doesn't it?" He smiled. Melissa raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I spent the next 2 days preparing. Grace helped me prep the envelopes, 3 of them, each carefully labeled. We reviewed the contents one last time. Notarized confirmation of the will, donation confirmation to the scholarship fund, and copies of the title search and final property transfer orders. I tucked a short letter inside each, addressed with care. By Sunday evening, the table was set. Candles lit, napkins folded. The good plates Melissa said were too formal for every day shone under the warm light. Melissa arrived first, in a silky blouse and her favorite perfume. "The place smells amazing," she said, peeking at the covered dishes. Jason came in behind her, loosening his tie, Noah bouncing at his side. "Grandma, you made meatloaf!" I laughed. "Of course I did." Melissa's mother arrived last, wearing pearls and her habitual mild condescension. "What's the big occasion?" she asked, patting my arm. I gestured to the table. "Sit, eat, then you'll know." The meal was warm, the kind that fills both belly and memory. We laughed, more than usual. Melissa even complimented my seasoning. Jason opened a bottle of wine. Noah told a joke involving frogs and spaceships that made absolutely no sense, but had everyone chuckling. And then, after dessert, I stood. 1 year ago this week, I began, I moved back into this home. It's been a year full of lessons. Jason raised his glass. To many more. Melissa clinked hers. To growth and gratitude. I smiled and reached under the table, lifting a small woven basket. Inside, 3 white envelopes. I have something for each of you, I said, placing one in front of Melissa, one in front of Jason, and one for her mother. Melissa's brow furrowed. What's this? Jason flipped his over, seeing his name in my handwriting. Is this about the house? In a way, I said, then turned to Noah and winked. You'll get yours later. Melissa opened hers first. Her eyes scanned the first page. The color drained from her face. Jason opened his, slower, more cautious. He read the notarized letter, the confirmation of transfer, the donation slip. This says the house is gone, he said, looking up at me. You gave it away? I did, I said calmly. Melissa's voice tightened. You gave it to a charity. To a scholarship fund, I said. For women like me, women who spent decades making space for others and now need help finding space for themselves. Melissa's mother blinked down at her envelope. Is this legal? Perfectly, I said. Finalized, documented, and irrevocable. Jason stood, hands trembling. Why didn't you talk to me? I tried, I said softly. For months, with dinners, with silence, with forgiveness, but no one listened. So I spoke in the only language this house seemed to respect, paperwork. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. I'm not angry, I added. This isn't punishment. This is clarity. Melissa opened her mouth, but no words came out. Noah looked between us all, confused. Are you leaving? I walked over and knelt beside him. I'm moving somewhere new, sweetie, but I'll always be around. We'll still bake cookies, and you can visit whenever you want. He nodded solemnly. Okay, but can I keep the leftover meatloaf? I smiled. It's already packed for you. The silence after the envelopes were opened was different from the usual domestic quiet. It wasn't the stillness of a peaceful evening. It was the stunned hush of realization setting in. Melissa's eyes darted across the printed email. Her lips moved slightly as she reread the words. Once the property title is fully under Jason's name. Below that, the agent's note in red. Timing is key. Suggest listing by late spring. Her hands trembled as she reached for the next document. My signed will, stamped, notarized, unshakable. Jason stood frozen, the property deed copy hanging limp in his hand. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. Across the table, Melissa's mother held her envelope delicately, like it might explode. I stayed seated, calm, measured. This house, I said, voice steady, was never legally transferred. The title has always remained under my name. I just forgot to remember it. Until recently. Jason blinked hard. You knew? For months, I said. Long enough to prepare. Long enough to learn how far things had gone without a single conversation. Melissa slammed her hand on the table. You went behind our backs. No, I replied, tone soft but sharp. You went behind mine. I simply followed. She looked to Jason, expecting backup. He stared at the table, jaw clenched, but said nothing. I reached into my lap and lifted the final page, a letter I had written by hand. I'd like to read something, I said. Melissa scoffed. Oh, please. Jason raised a hand. Let her talk. I nodded. Thank you. I unfolded the paper. My handwriting was neat, careful. To my family, this home was once a sanctuary, built by hands that held you, protected you, and fed you. Over time, I became a guest in it. Then an afterthought. Finally, an obstacle. I could have left in anger. I could have shouted. But instead, I chose clarity. I chose to reclaim my voice, not with rage, but with direction. I give this house not to my children, but to women who still have songs to sing, books to write, and dreams to resurrect. May it shelter them better than it sheltered me. I looked up. Jason was pale. Melissa stared blankly ahead. This is... She started, then stopped. It's legal, I said. It's final. And it's not a punishment. It's a gift. Just not to you. Jason's voice cracked. You didn't even give us a chance. I met his eyes. You had a year of chances. You gave those to someone else. Melissa's face flushed red. You think you're teaching us some moral lesson? You think this makes you noble? No, I said gently. It makes me free. The words hit harder than if I had shouted. They lingered in the room like smoke from a fire no one saw coming. Melissa's mother stood abruptly. Well, she huffed, I suppose we're done here. I nodded. We are. Jason sat down slowly, the weight of the envelope still in his hand. Where will you go? I already have a place. It's small, quiet, and entirely mine. Noah piped up, Do they have cookies? I smiled at him. Only the best. I rose from the table, gathered my things, just a shawl and my purse, and turned back to them. I hope someday you understand this wasn't about the house. It was about respect and knowing when to stop whispering in a room full of people who won't hear you. With that, I walked to the door. No tears, no dramatics, just the soft click of a woman choosing herself. I woke early the next morning, before the sun, before the sounds of the house stirred, before regret had a chance to creep in. The suitcase was already packed. Just clothes, some books, a framed photo of my husband and my journal. Everything else I had already transferred to the new apartment last week. Quietly, efficiently. In the kitchen, I brewed one last pot of real coffee. The rich scent filled the room, reminding me of the mornings when this place still felt like mine. I didn't leave a note. I didn't need to. By 6:15 a.m., the rideshare car was in the driveway. I stepped outside with my luggage, the chill in the air sharp but invigorating. The lights inside the house were still off. No goodbyes, no questions. Just as the driver placed my suitcase in the trunk, my phone buzzed. Melissa. How could you do this to us? I stared at the screen, then slowly typed back, I still love you, but I'm not stupid anymore. A moment later, another message appeared. Jason, you blindsided us after everything we did for you? I paused, then replied, yes, after everything. I turned off the phone. Silence was the only reply left to give. The drive to my new apartment took 30 minutes. I watched the streets pass by like scenes from a life I was finally exiting. There was no sadness, only relief. A quiet kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. When we pulled up to the retirement complex, the sun had just risen. Pale gold light touched the tops of the trees, and the pond outside shimmered like glass. The driver helped with my bags, smiled, and said, Big day? I nodded. The biggest. Inside, the apartment was warm and sunlit, a modest space, one bedroom, a kitchenette, a little balcony, but it smelled like lavender and new beginnings. On the counter sat a welcome basket from Grace, tea, cookies, and a card. You did it. You got out with your name, your power, and your peace. Proud of you. I smiled and placed the card on the mantel. Later that afternoon, I unpacked slowly. My books went on the shelf. My husband's photo went on the nightstand. I hung a small wind chime near the balcony door. Each sound felt like a declaration. You are here. You chose this. That evening, I received one last text from Noah. Grandma, are you safe? Do you still have cookies? I replied immediately. I'm very safe, and I have chocolate chip, oatmeal, and peanut butter. Visit soon? Yes. I miss you already. That one made my throat tighten, not from sadness, but from hope. Because even when adults forget, children remember. At sunset, I sat on the balcony, wrapped in my favorite shawl. I watched the sky shift from pink to violet, a new palette washing over the day. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing the piano. Soft, wandering notes floated through the air. I closed my eyes and listened. They say revenge is sweet, but this quiet, deliberate return to self was sweeter. Let them spin their stories. Let them grumble and post cryptic Facebook updates about betrayal. I would not engage. I would not explain. I had given them every chance. I had waited, served, endured. And now? Now, I had taken the last step they never saw coming. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to walk away before the door slams behind you. 3 months passed. I traded the heavy stillness of that house for the salty breeze of a coastal town. My new apartment, though modest, sat just 3 blocks from the beach. Every morning I walked the shoreline barefoot, letting the cold sand press against my soles and pull the weight of the past from my body. The ocean didn't ask questions. It didn't judge. It just came and went, consistent and honest. By afternoon, I traded sea foam for sidewalk chalk. A local youth center had been looking for volunteers to teach art. When I walked in and mentioned I used to teach, the coordinator nearly hugged me. So now, every weekday at 3:30 p.m., I sat in a circle of children, most of them from broken homes, foster care, or single-parent households, and taught them how to see the world through color. We painted grief in deep blues, resilience in orange, and joy in reckless pink. Some days were messy, others magical. One girl, Ava, never spoke, but she drew the most detailed butterflies I'd ever seen. When she smiled for the first time, I cried in the supply closet, silently, joyfully. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt useful. But what I didn't expect, what I'd stopped allowing myself to imagine, was companionship. His name was David. We ran into each other in line at the post office, literally. I backed up while reaching for a dropped letter and knocked over a stack of his packages. "I always make an entrance," I muttered, bending down to help. He chuckled. "You always had a way of stealing the show." I looked up and froze. David Brooks, my prom date. My first kiss behind the gymnasium in 1962, the boy who left for California to chase dreams and never returned. Until now. We stood there grinning like teenagers, both holding half-torn envelopes and unopened stories. Over coffee, he told me he'd been widowed 2 years. He had returned to his hometown to slow down, reconnect. "I didn't think I'd be reconnecting with you, though," he said with a wink. We didn't rush. We went for walks, compared reading lists, cooked badly and laughed about it. He came to one of my art classes and painted a crooked sailboat that the kids named the Grandpa Special. And he listened. He never asked for the full story of what happened with Jason and Melissa, but when I finally told him, he didn't interrupt or offer platitudes. He just held my hand and said, "I'm glad you chose yourself. A lot of people never do." Every now and then, Jason texted. Polite check-ins. Melissa sent none. Noah called on weekends. We talked about school, soccer, and what kind of cookie we'd bake next time he visited. He hadn't come yet, but I didn't pressure him. Love doesn't chase. It waits. One Sunday, David and I sat on a bench overlooking the shore. Seagulls squawked in the distance, and the tide rolled in steady and sure. "I'm thinking of buying a boat," he said suddenly. "You get seasick on the dock." He laughed. "I didn't say use the boat, just buy one. Park it and look mysterious." I elbowed him. "You're already mysterious. And old." He grinned. "But not alone." I turned to him and saw it in his eyes. The same spark from high school, but softer now. Earned. Weathered. Real. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just leaned my head on his shoulder. The breeze picked up, brushing my hair back like a mother smoothing her child's brow. I had survived betrayal, manipulation, and erasure. But here, in this little town with peeling paint and sea glass dreams, I found something rarer than revenge. I found peace. It started with a blank document and a blinking cursor. I hadn't written anything longer than a grocery list in years, but something stirred in me that morning. Maybe it was the salt in the air, maybe the quiet hush after David kissed my cheek and left for the hardware store. Maybe the memory of that cold donut still tucked in my bones. Either way, I opened my laptop, cracked my knuckles, and began to type. The warmest house isn't the one with the biggest kitchen or the softest couch. It's the one where you're seen, heard, and loved, not used. I didn't intend for it to be long, just a reflection, a journal entry. But as my fingers moved, the story poured out of me. Chapter by chapter, memory by memory. I wrote about the quiet kindness that became expected labor, about the polite cruelty of being spoken around instead of spoken to, about the realization that silence doesn't mean peace, it means erasure. I told the truth, how I cooked and cleaned, not out of obligation, but out of love, how that love was met with control, how I uncovered a plan, quietly, patiently, and walked away before I became another name, scratched off a deed. But I didn't write it with bitterness. I wrote it for the woman sitting at her daughter's kitchen table, wondering why her stories are never heard. I wrote it for the mother-in-law biting her tongue every day, afraid one word too many will get her moved from the guest room to the garage. I wrote it for myself, the version of me who sat in the dark with a birthday candle she lit alone. When I finished, I read it twice. Then, without second-guessing, I clicked post. The title was simple. I wasn't a burden. I was the foundation. Within 24 hours, it had 3,000 shares. By the end of the week, 60,000. Women commented from all over the country, New Mexico, Ohio, New York, each one with a version of my story in their heart. Thank you for writing what I didn't know how to say. I moved out 2 months ago. I thought I was alone. This made me cry, and then it made me stand up. Some messages came from daughters too, from women who had watched their mothers disappear into the background and were suddenly ashamed of their own silence. The editor of a major digital magazine emailed me personally. Would you consider expanding this into a series? Maybe even a book? I smiled at the irony. After a lifetime of being quiet, now the world was listening. Jason texted me that night. Saw the article, guess I deserved it. I didn't reply, because it wasn't about him anymore. It was about every woman who ever handed over her space, her voice, her value, because she was taught that's what good mothers do. A month later, on my 63rd birthday, I woke early and tied on my favorite apron. The kitchen in my apartment was small, but the sunlight poured through the windows like a blessing. I played an old jazz record, opened the flour jar, and started baking. Not for anyone else, not for forgiveness or attention, just for me. The cake was simple, vanilla with strawberry filling, topped with cream cheese frosting. I piped a single rose in the center, not perfect, but mine. I lit one candle, one flame. Then I sat at my tiny kitchen table, placed the cake in front of me, and whispered, "Happy birthday, Linda." And for the first time in a very long time, I blew out the candle, not to make a wish, but to mark the moment I finally chose myself,